Hi, I'm Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma, and it's been my enormous pleasure and my sometimes harrowing responsibility to try and render into a living, uh, poetic language in English the wonderful and great work of wisdom literature, one of the great works of wisdom literature in the Tamil language, the Kural, which is also known as the Kural. This work, which comes from at least 15 centuries, if not earlier, into the past, remains a extraordinary testament to the sensibility of a poet, of a language, and of an entire civilization. And it is a work which is on par with other world classics of wisdom literature, such as, say, the Tao Te Ching. And yet it's a work which has not gotten the same attention in English as other such works have gotten, largely, I think, because it hasn't been very well translated. People have often tried to translate its ideas and leaving its poetic qualities behind, whereas my feeling as a poet and as a scholar of the language is that this is a book that speaks to us most fully when its ideas and its poetry are completely integrated and interwoven and combined. And so, as part of my effort to introduce this work, to present it in a way that people can see how it speaks to us and to our times right now, I've been in the process of inviting a number of interesting people into what I'm calling Kural conversations. I'm inviting spiritual leaders and poets and translators and writers and teachers of all kinds to reflect on a handful of verses, 2 or 3 verses from one of the 133 chapters in the book, each of which deals with some particular subject, in such a way that we might get a taste not only of this magnificent work of poetry and philosophy, but also of how these verses are able to resonate across languages, across disciplines, across worlds, if you will. So it is my great pleasure to have with me today Ellen Kittredge, who is somebody I've known for, I think, even more than 20 years, if I'm correct, who we overlapped time at Oberlin College, and we even overlapped in Tamil Nadu sometime after that. And that may come up in our conversation, we'll see. But Ellen has followed a very beautiful path, focusing on what at one level could be called nutrition or nutritional healing, how what we eat and how we eat affects how we feel and how we live. But this journey has taken her beyond what might conventionally be called nutrition into the larger questions of how we nourish ourselves, both with food and how we nourish our spirits, and how we nourish our spirits as embodied beings living on the earth, how we relate to the earth beneath our feet, to the earth pulsing in our very bones, in our very bodies, in our blood and in our flesh. And so rather than introduce Ellen with a sort of title, such as, say, nutritionist, I really want to invite you into this conversation with me and Ellen, knowing that Ellen is a kind of healer and a kind of visionary, somebody who has an embodied form of wisdom that I'm really delighted to explore with you as we explore the work of Tiruvallur. So what I've done is I sent Ellen a copy of chapter 95 from the Tirukural, from the Kural. The title of the chapter is Medicine. However, if you read these verses, you'll see very quickly that they are as much about food and about eating as medicine, which is why I thought of Ellen. So I'm going to turn this over to Ellen with a question. My question is for Ellen is this, is when she encountered this work fresh and encountered the 10 verses in this chapter, is there any particular verse or maybe a handful of verses which jumped out at you? And that will be our point of departure. So I'm very pleased to introduce Ellen Kittredge.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's so lovely to be conversing with you again. And yes, it brings back many happy memories of being in Madurai and meeting one of your dear friends and teachers when I was there, which was such a wonderful opportunity to be introduced to him. Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity to have this conversation. It's really wonderful and feels very sacred to just be engaged with this. So thank you for this opportunity. I would say there's probably um, well there's several verses that sort of they all seem well they all flow together for me. So it's a little hard to pick one out specifically, but the verses that speak to digestion and then this idea of moderation or devouring beyond our limits. So all of those really speak to me. I don't know if there's a particular one, maybe if you wanted to read maybe 945 or 946.
Sure, let's start with 945. I'll just share this verse so that we can, those of you listening in on our conversation, listening in with us, participating with us, can enter into the verse with us. So this is verse 945. If one eats with measure what does not disagree, nothing threatens one's life. So let that sink in again. I'll read it a second time so you can allow both the ideas or the thoughts that may be presenting themselves to you through these verses, but also just the sounds of the words to bathe your ears. If one eats with measure what does not disagree, nothing threatens one's life. What struck you or strikes you about this particular verse on digestion?
Yeah, it's very multi-layered, and it's actually so beautiful to hear you read it, Tom. Thank you, because I can really take in the deeper essence with your voice and the connection, the clear connection that you have to this wisdom as well. So what comes to mind, I think, is I guess I see the potential for our relationship to food and eating to be very much like a spiritual practice. And that's something that I work with my clients on because I figure we eat, usually most of us, at least 3 times a day. And we have an opportunity every time we eat to be focused and attentive and connected to what we're doing. And so many of us, especially in today's day and age, run around distracted and never really completely connected and focused on what we're doing. So I really see eating as an opportunity, is it for time for meditation and connection, and that's on a sort of more spiritual level, you could say, a way to bring people into a deeper connection. But on a very practical, physical level, you can when you're eating with moderation, or you're eating what does not disagree, so what agrees with you, what's good for you. Well, first of all, you have to slow down to recognize what's good for you. And then once you do that, then you can be eating things that are actually deeply nourishing you. So I think what really speaks to me is the idea of like slow food or slow eating, and that potential that lives within that is that we can actually get to know what our body really likes and what our body doesn't like. And most of the clients that I work with, most that I see, really don't have a sense of what their body likes or what they don't like until they actually stop, and then they take things out or they eat in a different way, and then they start to actually connect with their body's wisdom. And I believe that we carry, everything we've ever experienced in our body. And so there's so much wisdom and depth in the physical body. And if we can get connected to that physical body and listen to that, we can learn a lot about ourselves and about life and about what's important. And it's a great way of listening, basically. So, so if one eats with measure what does not disagree, nothing threatens one's life. It feels like it's a very beautiful way of speaking to the idea of moderation and being in tune with what we need in life. And I think, some of the following verses from there speak about, yeah, not devouring beyond their fire's limits, and, those who devour no disease. And that really, the idea of just like eating too fast or eating too much, and that's out of balance with the physical body. So
That's
Yeah.
really that's beautiful. There's a couple things that are really striking to me in what you're saying, Ellen. One of them is this sense of what you said earlier about how these verses sort of flow together, and I think you can already see that the way that this verse sort of leads to this other verse about the fire of digestion, which I'm excited to get to, and also this sense of agreement and the sense of how do we know what agrees with our body,
Mhm.
and how that's not as simple a question as it might seem. It's not like there's a list of agreed foods. There,
Mhm.
you know, we know that a food that might be very nourishing to one person's bodily experience may not be. Somebody may be allergic to the same food, and their particular constitution, their particular stage in life, their particular mental and physical and spiritual state may, if they listen, be telling them, oh, what I really need to be eating is this other thing.
Mhm.
And that unless we open that space or allow there to be a kind of space whereby we can listen to, well, what does really agree with my body, and how would I know?
Mhm.
How do I learn to listen to my body in such a way that I can hear what it's telling me, rather than what I think it should be saying, if you will.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
you know, one of the things I love about having these conversations is that I you know, I've read these verses more times than I can count, but every time I learn something more. So, for instance, in this case, the verse says, "If one eats with a measure," and this idea of eating with measure, it suggests, you know, eating within a certain boundary or a certain understood um, uh, moderation. But I hadn't thought until I heard you speaking that, oh, and this sense of measure is also a sense of having that pacing by which we can slow down enough to listen.
Exactly.
So it's like a musical measure, you know, that when we listen to music, there's a kind of measuredness to the music, which sometimes may be tumbling along, rushing along, and sometimes may be very slow and languid, and have silences, which are as much a part of the music as the sounds. And
Mhm.
so now I get to hear this line, when one eats with measure, as a kind of musical experience, and as
Mhm.
a kind of listening experience, and a
Mhm.
spacious experience whereby uh, we have been able to slow down enough to hear what
Mhm.
truly agrees with us in any particular moment, um, and how that this leads to this extraordinary statement: nothing threatens one's life. Notice that the poet doesn't say, you know, most things or a
Mhm.
lot of things won't threaten you. Nothing
Yeah, I
threatens your
know.
life. I mean, that's a pretty all-encompassing statement, which I think highlights the extraordinary importance that the poet gives and is reminding us to, or encouraging us, helping us to see, to
Mhm.
this simple act of slowing down
Yeah.
and listening to our own embodied experience and the wisdom that our body already now has within it,
Mhm.
waiting in it for us to tap into and to be nourished by. Um,
Mhm.
really beautiful.
Yeah, it's what I find so so wonderful about working with clients with food, just that is as a particular avenue of, you know, entry point into people's lives, is it really, I do think it really does contain it all. I mean, that I agree with you that nothing threatens one's life seems quite a powerful statement. And I agree with you that it's really possible, I think, through the avenue of connecting to what we eat and seeing food as medicine, that we can actually get to that place, because it can, like I said, bring us into sort of more meditative states. It actually, you know, when we sit in that space of slowness, we brought into the parasympathetic um, nervous system state, which is rest, digest, heal, relax. And that is so profoundly healing for the rest of the nervous system in the body. And that's actually how we can actually digest our food, is to be in that state. But to do that, we have to slow down. We have to be in moderation. We really have to be more balanced. So yeah, so it's I really think, and when you're in that sympathetic nervous system place, when you're actually sorry the in the parasympathetic nervous system response, you don't feel like anything is threatening your life, and that's a very direct reality. When you're in the sympathetic response, that's where you're in fight or flight. So we actually want to get into the place of rest, digest, relax, heal, into the parasympathetic. And that will allow us to feel and know that nothing's threatening our life, which will then allow us to digest our food fully and take all of our nutrients from it. So that's what I was saying, was like multi-layered. It's like all these different pieces come in for me looking at that from what we know now, having, done so much incredible research and so much scientific exploration into how the body works and the nervous system and how that impacts your digestion and et cetera.
Yeah. So beautiful. Um, the way that all of these things interconnect.
Mm-hmm.
Scientific research, poetic evocations, poetic understandings, spiritual
Mm-hmm.
practice, just daily bodily practice of eating. Um, I'm curious. What I'm tempted to do is to lead us to a verse that's two verses away, and then come back to the verse in between them, just to see
Absolutely.
what might do. Um, you alluded to a phrase, beyond their fire's limits. So I wanted to read that verse, which is verse 947, and just see how our conversation reverberates with this verse, and then go to the one in between them, just as a kind of sandwich, if you will, just to see what that might reveal. So here's the verse. This is verse 947, and I'll repeat it twice, so you can listen once for what you hear the words saying, and listen again for whatever you might want to listen to a second time. Those who devour beyond their fire's limit know disease beyond limit. Here again is that verse. Those who devour beyond their fire's limit know disease beyond limit.
So what struck me, sort of immediately about this verse was the, Agni is the word for fire in, is it Sanskrit?
It's a Sanskrit word, yes,
Sanskrit,
and
yeah,
of course
yeah,
found in many Indian languages now.
yeah, yeah. And so the idea of Agni is the sort of spiritual fire, but it's really the digestive fire when you look at it from the Ayurvedic standpoint, as I understand. I'm not trained specifically in Ayurveda, I just know a little bit about it. But so the idea of devouring beyond the limit of what we can digest, what our digestive fire is, that is just speaks exactly to what happens to so many people. As we eat too much or we eat the wrong foods, we can't digest them, and then we end up with toxicity in the body, and then that causes a whole host of health issues. So there's a very sort of, very direct, for me, that's a very directly speaking to that, and the idea of like, knowing no disease beyond limit, that's kind of scary, right? It's just like that, there's no limit to the disease that might happen if you're devouring beyond your fire's, beyond your fire's limit. It's so beautiful the way it's written, um, and and very true. I just think it's a very deeply true statement about what I understand, at least, to be the case, when we eat the wrong things, eat too much in general, or eat in a way that is not allowing us to actually digest our food, which again comes back to what I was saying before about really needing to be in that space of, relaxation before we enter into our relationship with food, with the food on our plate. So yeah.
Something beautiful here about, there is a tendency to think of limits as being, in some ways, a negative thing. You don't want to be limited, and we want to have an open and expansive experience. And yet there's a sense here in this verse that there is something about finding that sense, to put it in another way, that sense of measure.
Mm-hmm.
or that sense of balance between, say, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems, so that there is a recognition of what I think our embodied experience has us, when we fully live it, recognizing is that there is a sense simultaneously of a limitedness and a limitlessness that are somehow much more deeply intertwined than our words might at first suggest. So that this sort of, the idea of disease beyond limit, that is a kind of terrifying idea. And it's
Yeah.
terrifying precisely because there aren't limits. The idea that,
Mhm.
a disease might just become limitless, endless, all pervading, and that there's something connected to the recognition of, I think this is enough food for me in this moment, that
Mhm.
leads to its opposite, which is a kind of limitless health, if you
Yes,
will,
indeed,
a
indeed.
limitless sense of wellness and well-being. And I love also the connection that you were making to fire, as the verse itself says, this, both the sense of the fire of digestion, the fact that we're actually, we talk about burning calories and sort of everyday talk, but there is this, the energy of this heat, which is an energy, which is a physical energy and also a spiritual energy, which
Mhm.
is, you can't sort of extract them from each other. These are two uh, integral parts of its nature. I'm reminded of how Thoreau and Walden speaks about how, all so much of our effort is really about how do we maintain the vital heat within us.
Mhm.
And Thoreau, of course, along with the Iliad at his writing desk at Walden, also was reading a copy of the Bhagavad Gita and was exploring some of the wisdom traditions of India,
Mhm.
and
Mm.
their understanding of fire, of heat,
Mhm.
as a very, simultaneously grand kind of spiritual principle, but also a very deeply embodied experience of the body. Um, Between these two verses, between 945 and 947, there's verse 946, which seems like a perfect place for us to go to now. In verse 946, the poet says, "Those who eat, knowing moderation, know joy, as those who devour know disease."
Mm.
I'll share that one more time. Those who devour, sorry, those who eat knowing moderation know joy, as those who devour know disease. I think, even just exploring these three verses that in this case happen to be side by side, you can see how they're all, in a way, speaking to and with each other.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so
Yeah.
I'd be curious what, if anything, in this particular verse sort of amplifies or comments upon or sheds light upon what we were speaking about with the other two
Mhm.
verses.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple things. I think there's um I guess the idea of our, our passions or our the idea of I guess I just for me it just keeps coming back to this idea of, meditation or being the moderation, the being the sense of like the what I'm getting from what he's sharing in this chapter is this is finding that middle point, that balance point in life, and not going too far in one direction or the other, um, but specifically not being devoured by our hungers. And you just think about, things like alcoholism or other addictions, or that's what comes to mind, I think, is that those can sort of, we can become addicted to something, and food is a very easy thing to become addicted to because we have to eat every day, right? So it's not something we can let go of and not do. So if we have addictive tendencies, then it can come out very strongly in food, which is a lot of people really struggle with that. And that's what comes to mind, is that sense of the devouring is what causes the disease. So it's too much of something, whatever that addictive tendency is. And with spiritual practice, I think that's what we come face to face with oftentimes, is where are those places where we're our addictions are leading us in a place that is not helpful and not healthy, and how can we then get back into moderation? And I think that, I'm sure probably most every human being on the planet struggles on some level with that. So it feels like it just really speaks to that, and that when we eat knowing moderation, we know joy. So you can say again, on the spiritual level, we look at that, with the moderation that brings us to a place of maybe equanimity and balance and peace and joy, and those things that all kind of come together. But just, again, on the sort of base level of the actual physical body, if we're eating in moderation, we know joy is because we're not feeling sluggish because we ate too much, and we're not waking up the next morning with a little bit with a hangover or something, so we're actually, our spirits can be higher and more elevated, we can feel better. And my best, one of the things that I always blows me away every year when I offer my seasonal cleanses is there's like 3-week program where basically you just get rid of the most inflammatory and allergenic foods. And people always find that by about day 3 or 4, they're starting to feel a level of joy and happiness that starts to come in. And they're like, this is amazing. I had no idea. And then usually by the end of the cleanse, they're just really, again, it's like much more peaceful. And within that peace is there's a sense of being able to be joyful as well. And it's because they're not being triggered by these foods that are causing inflammation in the physical body. So it's very much on the base physical level. Just, we eat in moderation, we eat the things that are good for us, and we feel better physically, and that can allow us to be more joyful. And then there's the other thing that's connected as well, which is, of course, the brain chemistry. And our what we eat is so connected to our neurotransmitters, because most of our neurotransmitters are in the gut, actually. And so certain foods, if we're eating foods that are inflammatory to us or that we're mildly allergic to, we didn't know we're sensitive to, that can cause depression. Like a really good example is a lot of people with chronic depression, they stop eating gluten, and suddenly their depression goes away. Maybe not suddenly, but over time, as their gut heals, their depression starts to lift. And it's because it's being caused by, inflammation, the way the gluten is breaking down the lining of the gut and causing inflammation. So yeah, so there's a lot there. I think there's just one more thing, Tom, too, if it's okay, I share one more
Sure,
piece. But,
please.
one thing that has become really really trendy, and I think it's a good trend, is intermittent fasting. And this idea of, just eating maybe a couple meals a day and taking much longer break in between when you're eating, because that gives your body time to digest. And there's a couple earlier verses that, speak a little bit even more specifically to that. But that was another thing that was coming to mind as I was reading this, was this like, wow, it feels like there's really deep wisdom in there about that. And my one of my Ayurvedic teachers in my nutrition training program that I went to, he said something about, in his estimation, when you're the healthiest person is going to be eating actually just one meal a day. But most people can't do that. And you shouldn't try to do that until you're ready to do that. But the reason that you can get to that place where you're just eating one meal a day is because you have everything else in your life is so in balance, and you're getting so much nourishment from your spiritual practice, from drinking plenty of water, from having, beautiful work that you're feeling aligned with in the world and doing, and all of those things are in balance. So you don't actually need as much nourishment from your physical food. And you can just eat once a day. And that is, that the studies showing longevity connected to intermittent fasting are, quite remarkable. So yeah.
That's so interesting. I'll just share one of the verses that speaks directly to this idea of um, of allowing the body to be to fast, to not eat, which we even have in English in our word breakfast. Breaking the fast after sleep, so that in a way we are all intermittently fasting if we're getting
Mhm.
some sleep at night. And what can happen if that space expands, and we are able to listen to our bodies in such a way that we can recognize, oh yeah, this is actually enough for me because I'm also being nourished by all of these other things. This is one of I mean, when I first was reading and studying this work, and then again when I was translating it, I was really struck by verse 942, where the poet says, "The body needs no medicine if one eats only after digestion," which is followed immediately by verse 943. "Eat after digestion, knowing one's limits. This way, those with a body live long." And in a way, what we were talking about with the verses that follow this one, with that sense of coming to know, well, what is the food that agrees with us? What is, what are the limits of our digestive fire? And that when we come to have this knowledge and we are then able to eat only after digestion, having felt, well, what does it mean for that entire process to have completed itself? How to even come to a place where we can sense that, and then this possibility of not needing any medicine, of thriving and living long, which I think means not just living a long time, but living a full and expansive and a very rich life, even if it may not be long in earthly years. There's a sense of how much hinges on that capacity to know, oh, this is my body after digestion. This is what it feels like to have eaten what agrees with me, and so on. So that, I think that is really a beautiful way of showing how, a wisdom, a work of wisdom literature like this one continues to be wise, continues to resonate, even as similar ideas studied from different angles and with the vocabulary of different disciplines yield similar insights into the possibility of balancing between the times that we eat and the times that we are not eating. Really beautiful. Before we bring our conversation to a close, I wanted to ask if you had any questions for me about the work or about the experience of translating it, anything that may have come up for you as you were sitting with these verses.
Well, I'm glad that I got a chance to read your introduction as well, because that was really helpful. And there were a couple things I just wanted to say that, just loving this idea of like what it means to live a good life, and that this is what is captured in this, that overall, that idea. And that just resonates, I guess, so much with what I like to try to offer my clients and remind people that we can live a really good life. We just have to sometimes, make these different modifications, and it actually really will benefit. But I think the question that really comes to mind, there was something else that you wrote that you mentioned. I didn't write it down exactly, so forgive me if I'm quoting it slightly incorrectly, but so that the different sections are on virtue, wealth, and love. And then you mentioned that he doesn't actually write, or what's not included is liberation from the cycle of birth and death. I was wondering if you could just share like a little more about that, because but then you said something about if you follow these chapters on the virtue, wealth, and love, if you sort of, my sense was if you embody the wisdom, if you follow that, then the liberation from the cycle of birth and death is then, I don't know if it's guaranteed, but it's perhaps a pathway to that. So I just wondered if you could maybe speak a little bit more about that.
Sure, it's a beautiful question. There is a traditional and I think very powerful view, which is that there are, and one of the conceptions of what it means to live a life in the context from which Tervalluvar is writing out of and from, there are sort of four main areas of life. There's virtue and the home life. There's the question of power and wealth. And then there's the question of love, bodily love, erotic love, romantic love. And then there's the area of liberation, moksha, liberation from the cycle of samsara, from the round of birth and death. And it is striking that Theravada focuses on these first three and omits the fourth entirely. And what commentators have said, and which I think makes great sense, is that the implicit teaching is that if we really do these other three right, liberation from the cycle of birth and death, however one understands that, comes of a course, comes naturally, comes effortlessly, and maybe even inevitably, because we have lived those other aspects of life completely. There's a sense in which the book is so all-encompassing, it dealing with all of, with food, with hospitality, with what it means to be king, what it means to be the advisor to a king, to the ins and outs of love relationships, all of these things. And it's just if we get all of those pieces in place and in harmony, in a kind of measure and balance, then of course, of course, we experience and are liberated and are free from the sorrows of the round of birth and death. And in that, there is also, this just occurs to me now, and I'm not sure if this is a traditional view or if this is just something that's occurring to me rightly or wrongly, which is that, if we focus on it, it's equally possible to become kind of fixated on our idea of, you name it, whether it's liberation, whether it's enlightenment, whether it's inner peace or so on, and we become very intent on achieving this thing. And we may neglect other aspects of life, like virtue, or the question of money, or the question of how we eat, or how power plays out in our everyday relationships. As this is something that Gandhi was so perceptive about, how the practice of nonviolence isn't just a matter of social protest, but is something that has to do with how we talk with each other in the streets, in our homes, in our day-to-day lives, as much as in a grand political statement, as he was also capable of helping people to make. So in a way, maybe one of the things the poet is suggesting to us is that the way of liberation may come by not fixating or even becoming addicted to that possibility, but rather by saying, well, how might that look in all of these other areas of my life? How might this look when I sit down to eat a meal or two a day, 3 a day, whatever is right, agrees with me at my stage and station in life. So there is, there's a curious way in which this work, which is comprised of these very short verses organized into chapters and into sections, is saying more than it says. Even in the way that the verses speak to each other and the books speak to each other. You've pointed to maybe one of the largest questions about how it speaks to these three, but not this fourth area of life, because this fourth is somehow included in all of the three. And so that the book says things without saying them if we are able to slow down and listen.
Yeah. Well, what comes to mind, and as you're sharing all this, Tom, is what one of my teachers, a Buddhist teacher, says, which is we need to go from negative habit to positive habit to go beyond all habit. And this idea, so there negative habit might be those desires that are overwhelming us, or where we're devouring too much, we're out of balance, basically. All of the ways that our addictions control us, rather than being something that we can work with in a balanced way. So moving from that sort of negative habit to positive habit, and doing these things in a more balanced, harmonious way. And then from that place, maybe then there is that is like the springboard from which we then can reach reach enlightenment, or, like you said, whatever we want to call it. But yeah, no, really, I imagine, I guess this is why this work still speaks to so many through so many generations, is because there is such deep wisdom in it, and it really is so multi-layered and multifaceted, and there's just so much to explore. It feels like it's never ending.
Yes, it is limitless in the most wonderful of ways.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad, Ellen, that you could join me, join the poet, and explore this with us together.
Mhm.
For those of you who are listening and you would like to know more, explore what Ellen has to offer, you can visit her website, ellenkittredge.com. I'll put the link up. I'll post the link, and you can explore that way. She works with people one-on-one. She has this wonderful annual cleanse that she has mentioned, and then I know personally a number of people who have benefited greatly from doing this cleanse with her. So please do explore what she has to offer, because she has an abundance to offer. And if you're curious to know, to explore the Kural, the Tirukural of Tiruvalluvar, the book goes on sale January 11th, 2022. So if you're watching this before this, you can pre-order it. On my website, thomaspruiksma.com, there are some links to some places where you can pre-order the book at a pre-order discount. And then if you're watching this after that, the book should be available any place that good books are sold. And if it's not, ask for it and see if they can get some in for you. So thank you to everyone who's listening. Thank you again to Ellen, and all good wishes to all of you and all of us.
Thank you so much, Tom.